Hello and welcome back to Com 100 Rhetoric and Society. Today we're going to be discussing the two speeches that you looked at for our last class period, that being Dr. MLK's I Have a Dream speech and also an address on civil rights by JFK. Both of these are profoundly important texts, profoundly important speeches for us to examine. In King's case, it's because it's a masterclass in metaphor. It is beautiful and an incredible example of using metaphors to persuade. And in the case of JFK, he makes a case for what equality and what justice means, at least how he is referring to it. And anytime someone's talking about justice or equality, it's important to see how they define it. And Kennedy there sets up a definition of justice or equality through how he talks about opportunities. He's also talking about the University of Alabama, which is particularly interesting to us on campus. But let's start with MLK. One of the things that we need to do when we engage a text, when we look at a speech or any artifact, is try to examine the rhetorical situation. The rhetorical situation is a set of circumstances that helps us interact with and engage with a text. It provides context and also sets up a way for us to understand how the persuasion is working in the text. For instance, the rhetorical situation for the I Have a Dream speech was the rhetor. Of course, we know the rhetor, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What is the text? Well, it's the speech itself. We sort of luck out there in that the speech is the text, and we have the text of the speech. What do you think the audience was? Um, it's not up in the air. I leave a question mark there because I want you to think about what you would consider the audience for this speech or this address. At the same time, also, what do you think is the purpose? Try to identify those parts of a rhetorical situation for yourself. The setting, of course, is August 28th, 1963, at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The reason I say that entire title is because typically we remember it as the March on Washington. We forget what the March on Washington was for. We forget that there were specific policy demands and say, oh, it was just a march for civil rights. Well, not just for civil rights. It wasn't just a broad march for equality, and that's something that gets sort of whitewashed out of the civil rights movement are the specific demands that were made then that still have not been fulfilled today. And that's sort of what King is even talking about in the speech in a nice bit of unfortunate hindsight and sort of irony there. But it's a march on Washington for jobs and freedom in 1963. This was the speech itself. I like this video version. I think it's a good version just because it provides more than just the speech itself. It's also the speech in full, which when you're looking at videos, it's important to get the entire context so you can read all of the text. But let's look at some of the things that King does in this speech that make it so noteworthy and stand out so much. I think we do an okay job of letting people know about this speech and letting them know about the address. Um, but even when we hold it up as a standard bearer for civil rights rhetoric, for that rhetorical pulpit, we do a bad job of telling students why it's such a standout speech, why it's so remarkable. So let's look at some of the details, some of the rhetorical flourishes that King uses that make it a great speech. First, we have some of King's appeals to time. King is very interesting in his approach here. And I say interesting in that it's very systematic. It seems designed to help make his point and at the same time remain incredibly relatable and inspiring. So that's a tough thing to do, to argue and inspire at the same time. But one of the ways that King manages to do that is through his appeals to time. The speech starts out with King acknowledging place, acknowledging where he's giving the speech in front of the great emancipator, as he's called, Abraham Lincoln. And he mentions the history and sort of how history has led to his moment. He talks about 100 years later, right after emancipation, where's the nation? And then we also get flourishes that we see throughout the speech, where King marks now as the time to demand and pursue racial equality. And later in his speech, one day, he's looking towards the future, where things like segregation and racism have fallen out of fashion, at least with the children, right? And so time plays a remarkable role in this speech, especially the way that King manipulates it. We talk about the past, we talk about the present, and then we talk about a hopeful future. That's a very intelligent way to organize your speech. We also have, starting his great use of metaphors, so many economic and financial metaphors in this speech. We have the image of a check and a promissory note, which function very similar. Defaulted, that means that you cannot pay your loan, right? You've defaulted on a loan. We've got insufficient funds or insufficient balances of justice. We talk about the bank of justice, right? How justice is this bank where people have been written a check by the Constitution, but how the government has failed to ever actually cash that check of equality. We've got bankruptcy, and using bankrupt as a term for like moral bankruptcy as well. A smart turn of phrase there, and including it in the speech just hammers home these financial metaphors. The riches of freedom, viewing freedom and equality and justice as monetary and calling them riches that are owed to the people, and then cashing in on the check and the idea of having cash in your hand, where a check is a promise, but when you have the cash yourself, when you have the riches for yourself, then you can actually enjoy them, especially when you've been told that they're yours in the first place. Another set of metaphors that King uses are landscape metaphors or naturalistic metaphors. Using naturalistic metaphors or landscape metaphors is ultimately an appeal to nature. And anytime you see an appeal to nature in a speech, a connection to, I don't know, like plant lives, like landscape, animals, anytime you see those appeals to nature, notice how they're being used. Because when we make an appeal to nature, typically we're saying that what we're pursuing is natural, is normal, in the course of existing, in the course of life. It's a natural, normal thing. And knowing that, King uses landscape metaphors and nature metaphors to set up justice and equality as natural courses of things. That to receive these equal rights, to receive equal treatment under the law, is just as natural as a mountain or a river. And the ways that he does that, we get the mentions of peaks and valleys, of the quicksand of injustice and the solid rock of equality. We get shadows and light. King also talks about justice like water and righteousness like a stream, and both washing over. We get a storm of persecution, winds of police brutality. Essentially, this is poetry, right? It's using metaphors to connect what he's talking about to nature, and it shows us how he wants us to react to those things. When he mentions that justice is like water and righteousness is a stream, we need water to survive. We're also 70% water. When he calls persecution a storm and talks about the winds of police brutality, storms can be dangerous. Winds can be incredibly dangerous. So he's connecting these things also to natural items, natural artifacts that we already have reactions to. He talks about the valley of the despair and the mountain of despair, but also the stone of hope. These metaphors are images, and they're great ways to combine signs and symbols to get us to think a certain way about the topic. You don't even have to make an explicit argument when you've done such a good job with metaphor. If you set someone up to understand something through signs and symbols that they already have meanings attached to, then they're already going to think a certain way about that subject. I'm a fan of Taco Bell. I think it's an okay restaurant, but it tastes good. And if I use metaphors to talk about Taco Bell that were really positive, then you could conclude that I had a positive opinion of Taco Bell versus if I was using um, metaphors that had negative connotations with Taco Bell, then you could assume safely, because of what you know about symbols and what you know about our cultural scripts, that I had a poor opinion of Taco Bell. And here, King does a beautiful job of making it absolutely clear what he thinks and how he wants his audience to think as well. Let's move on to Kennedy for a moment. John F. Kennedy. Let's look at the rhetorical situation for his address on civil rights. Who is the rhetor? It's Kennedy. If you want to get more specific, you could talk about the speechwriters as well, people who helped compose um, the text. You could also include that discussion in the text. I also want to point out here an interesting tidbit about the rhetorical situation. If you notice, it's 5 pieces long. And if you took the time to write out and explain each piece, you would have an okay essay, right? That's a fine way to discuss and write about a piece of rhetoric, is just give a paragraph to each piece of the rhetorical situation, and then make sure you're including some implications about your observations or some arguments. But the rhetor for this speech is JFK. What is the text? Again, we left out here. It's the address. We can look at it written down, and we can watch videos of it because it was broadcasted live on television, which is helpful for us. Again, I leave the audience of this address and the purpose of it up to you. What do you think they were? Who were the audience for this address? And what do you think the purpose was? What's the setting? The setting is June 11th, 1963. He's talking about the integration of the University of Alabama campus here in Tuscaloosa. And he's also sort of setting up and setting a vision for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in which LBJ gets credit for getting it passed because it happened in the wake of Kennedy's assassination. So let's look to see why this address is interesting. One of the reasons is because how you are, as a student at the University of Alabama, connected to this speech inherently. Alabama has a knack for getting into national headlines and moments in history for the wrong reasons. And we shouldn't look past that as faculty members and students at the institution. It's also an R1 institution with one of the several of the top programs for what it offers in the country. So it's a good school, and it has worked very hard to change its reputation since its infamous role in the civil rights movement. But certainly, as someone who's still here, we're still making the news for negative reasons, and things are not perfect on campus. So it's important to reflect on that and look at your relationship to the rhetorical place that is our university. Even Reese Pfeiffer, right, the building where the College of Communication and Information Sciences is centered, was once the student union and has a history and a disturbing history in the civil rights movement that you should check out. Look up the history of Reese Pfeiffer and the civil rights movement. This is a history that's still alive and living today. So let's talk about those appeals to equality. Because anytime you go out to define what equality means, what justice means, sort of practically, it's important to analyze that, because a lot of times things are called justice or things are called equality that are anything but, right? So we need to explore what's spelled out for us in order to be able to discern the definition and then respond accordingly. One is military service. Kennedy makes the observation that we don't seem to be very discriminatory when it comes to the draft right? When it comes to serving your country, you go away, conceivably, you're being told to fight for freedom, and then you come back to a place where you can't even eat lunch at a certain restaurant because of your race. So using that as an appeal to equality is interesting, in part because military service is still used as a pin of equality, especially with the LGBTQ community and also with trans soldiers recently. We've been looking at the ability to serve for your country as an indicator of equality, which is an interesting one. It's been used successfully to make good arguments. At the same time, there's people that argue against using this appeal, saying that when we argue for military equality first, we're sort of leaving a bunch of assumptions about America's role internationally left unexplored. So it's an interesting appeal. But yeah, the military is always comes up in this discourse. And as a child of the army, right, with my father, grandfather, brothers in the army, it's what I pay attention to because it means something to me. I have a personal connection. We also talk about the opportunity for receiving domestic service or the opportunity to be a customer, which again is very interesting. We look at it in our society as a privilege to be able to be a patron of the service industry, which is fascinating, right? Again, for the assumptions that it concretizes or makes solid about our country that we then don't have to analyze. Questions about our economic system and economic justice can go by the wayside when we say, well, as long as everyone has the opportunity to spend their money, then we're okay. But he mentioned specifically being able to stay at a hotel, eat at a restaurant, or sit where you'd like in a theater. I don't want you to lose the fact that for the state of Alabama, the woman who integrated grade school, who integrated kindergarten, I believe, uh, is still alive and well and only in her 60s. So this is not something that's some far distant past. Just because the television footage is in black and white does not mean we're still not dealing with these things. He talks about also education and employment, um, both areas where there are still discrepancies. I think Kennedy does a smart job here in mentioning things that we can literally look and track the statistics of to see the racial disparities. Racism is something that you can see, something that you can track. So it's not this, it is an ideology, but it also has very specific, observable material consequences. And a lot of times when you have people denying racism, uh, they don't bring those things up. And that's just not arguing well. He also mentions healthcare and health outcomes and also police brutality. Again, these issues are all things that we're still talking about that haven't been either corrected or corrected fully, um, which is interesting to note. But looking at these appeals to equality, what Kennedy says equality means, how far do you think we've gotten in his vision or what he's setting out to be the case? Like I said, looking at it, and if you look at the numbers, we haven't gotten there yet. And so it's our job as people who believe in the promises of our Constitution to make sure that those equalities are realized. To me, there's nothing more patriotic than getting your nation, your family, your community, your state, your county, whatever the case is, getting it to live up to the rhetorical promises of its creation. If it defines itself in a certain way, then holding it accountable to that rhetoric, I think, is incredibly patriotic and incredibly powerful. And if we have a rhetorical education, then it becomes our duty because we're viewing rhetoric as a democratizing, equalizing force in art. Here's a quotation from Kennedy's address that I think is very interesting. As I've said before, not every child has an equal talent or an equal ability or equal motivation, but they should have the equal right to develop their talent and their ability and their motivation to make something of themselves. I think that's a great quotation, and I think it rings profoundly true that when we're talking about equality, we're not talking about making everyone the same. That is a terrible, bad faith straw man argument that hopefully you can see through. When we talk about equality, we're talking about equal opportunities, equal chances, right? The chance to have equal outcomes. And if those chances don't exist, then we don't have equality. It's not saying, perhaps you've read like Harrison Bergeron, right? Where exceptional people are sort of weighed down. That's not at all what we're talking about. And I think Kennedy does a good job of speaking that to power in this address. And a good example is this quotation. So I hope you've enjoyed these two speeches. Again, if you haven't watched them, go engage with them, watch the videos, read the text. They are great pieces of rhetoric, and we can get to some amazing arguments just by analyzing the rhetoric. So by looking at a message and using what we know, we can dig much deeper into just, well, what does the author mean here, right? What do you think that means? Not only is it what do you think that means, but what do you think it means for the speaker? What do you think it means for the audience then? What do you think it means for the audience now? What do you think it means for us analyzing it and critiquing it? You get a lot of these opportunities to learn and to dig deep into something through rhetorical processes. And even if we're just looking at the rhetorical situation, there's still lively analysis that we can make. And I say that passionately and excitedly because rhetoric gives us a great way to combine philosophy, history, literature, all of these things together into one analysis. And for me, as someone that's just fascinated by this world that we live in, that's one of the best opportunities we've got for learning about it. So that is these two speeches. We'll probably reference them going forward, but have a good weekend, and you'll hear from me on Tuesday.